On April 21, 1923, the art historian Abi Varborg gave a lecture at the Sanatorium Bellevue in Kreuzlingen about his trip of 1895-1896 to the land of the Hopi in Arizona, which during this period was widely known for the most photographed and filmed ritual in North America, the 9th day of the snake ritual, the snake dance. There is no record of Warburg's lecture of 1923, but only a bundle of various texts for the preparation of the lecture, which Warburg wrote together with his colleague Fritz Sachsel in Kreuzlingen. A version of the lecture was first published in 1939, 10 years after Warburg's death and against his explicit wish that none of these notes would ever be published. It has since become one of the single most widely read texts by Varborg and indeed of 20th century art history. Perhaps that is because the text, or assemblage of texts, is a chimera. The snake ritual was the most often photographed and filmed Native American ritual in the time following the end of the Indian Wars and the closure of the frontier. It was part of the Wild West, or for some time, it was the Wild West. The history of the fascination with the snake ritual and the history of the fascination with Warburg's text have little to do with the ceremonial order of the Hopi. In fact, the snake ritual does not hold a very special place in this ceremonial order. All Hopi rituals revolve around the petition for rain for the Hopi as desert inhabitants with a precarious agriculture. And since the clouds are identified with the dead, every rain incantation is also an evocation of the dead. They are explicitly present in the non-public rites. Varborg says in the text that he will first describe the rational element of Hopi culture, its architecture, including what is probably the oldest continuously inhabited place in North America, and its context of geography markedly defined by the scarcity of water. He then describes elements of Hopi cosmology and adds to the rational what he deems to be the irrational element, which is symbolized by the snake. Varborg writes, "A drawing which I acquired from an Indian proves that what appears to be purely decorative ornament must in fact be interpreted symbolically. One of the basic elements of cosmological imagery, the universe conceived in the form of a house, is united in this drawing with an irrational animal conception, a serpent, which appears as an enigmatic and awe-inspiring demon." Hopi society for Varborg is located midway between logic and magic. Its instrument of orientation is the symbol. And then he seeks to escape his falsely projected polarity of primitive and enlightened, midway as it were, by suggesting that this in-between stage may be characteristic of all human culture. He lists various elements of Hopi cosmology by mentioning some of the intermediaries and messengers in the Hopi cosmos, such as birds, feathers, and the snake, which is a messenger to the underworld and at the same time a symbol of lightning. Varborg writes, "In my hotel in Santa Fe in Indian, Cleo Jurina and his son consented after some demur to do some colored crayon drawings for me, representing their conception of the cosmos. The father, Cleo, was one of the priests and painters of the Kiva in Kushiti. The drawing showed the snake as a weather god, without feathers, but otherwise drawn exactly like the figure on the vase, with a sharp pointed tongue in the shape of an arrow. The roof of the walled house has a terraced gable. Above the wall stretches the rainbow and rain, represented by short strokes, streams from the massed clouds below. In the middle, as master of the cosmic house of the thunderstorm, Gewitterwelten house, is the fetish, Yaya or Yerik. And he goes on. Steps and ladders are an ancient and universal device for representing the growth, the upward and downward motion of nature. They are the symbol of achievement in the rise and descent through space. Just as the coiled serpent is the symbol for the rhythm of time. But we must not think of this walled house as the simple reflection of a tranquil cosmology, for the mistress of the house is the most fearsome of all beasts, the serpent. In the lecture notes, Varborg describes an antelope dance in San Ildefonso, which he witnessed and identifies as a hunter's ritual. Later, the same ritual is oriented towards what he calls a perfect animistic cult of the tree, which, as we know, persists to this day in the heathen practices at harvest time in Europe, and belongs to the basic religious conceptions of all mankind. He reports from the Homish Kashina, dance of Oraibi, and speaks of the role of Hopi clowns, their humor and their obscenity that are necessary supplements to the solemn piety of Hopi ritualism. Anyone acquainted with ancient tragedy will recognize in this combination the dual nature of the tragic chorus and the satyr play, both grafted onto one stem. At the heart of the lecture is the snake dance, which Varborg did not attend. It would have been the next ceremony, right after the Hemiskachina dance that he saw, which was part of a goodbye ceremony for the masks, the season of the Kachinas. He calls it the supreme example of magical assimilation to nature by way of the animal world. He says, "For in the month of August, when the critical moment of the year has arrived in the work of the fields, and the whole success of the harvest depends on a heavy fall of rain, the storm, with its blessed relief from drought, is invoked in a dance with live serpents." That ceremony is no mere imitation of animals. They themselves play their part as actors in the ritual, not to be sacrificed, but to join in the petition for rain. The ceremony culminates in these acts: the approach to the bush, the seizing and carrying about of the live snakes, and finally, the sending away of the snakes to the plain as intercessors. Varborg writes of the background of this ritual. From what we know of the Walpi Indian mythology, we may be sure that this form of serpent worship has a background in tribal legends. We are told of a certain hero called T.U. who set out in a journey underground to discover the source of the longed-for water. He passes the various kivas of the princes of the lower regions, accompanied all the time by a female spider who sits unseen on his right ear and guides him, a kind of Indian Virgil to this Indian Dante. And eventually, after passing the two houses of the sun in the west and in the east, he comes to the great kiva of the snakes, where he is presented with the magic Ha-Hu, which invokes the weather. According to the story, Tu brings back with him two female snakes who bear him children, also in the form of snakes, very dangerous creatures who in the end compel the tribes to change their dwelling place. This myth is recounting how the cultural hero of the Serpent clan, out of thirst for knowledge, went into the underworld to find the source of water, where he meets serpent people, of whom he takes one or two girls along, for the Snake clan and for the Flute clan. He marries one of the girls, is instructed and initiated by a snake priest in the snake ritual that he and his serpent bride, who gives birth to snakes and serpent clan people, bring along with him into this world. The ninth day of the ritual with the snake dance celebrates, in this sense, the arrival of the clan on this side of the world. The fascination at the time for the snake ritual led to the fact that this actually secret travel tale of the snake clan was printed in some travel guides to the snake ritual. For example, in House Travel Guide for the Santa Fe Railroad Company, which is also in Varborg's library. Almost all journalistic and touristic accounts focus on this arrival of the snakes and serpent people from the underworld, as an arrival in the image which one has followed to its source. And because it is the last day, this dance is also about dismantling the image and discarding it by sending it away. The white tourists from settler society and the so-called modern world, like the snakes, were a deadly danger. This image, condensed into the Kodak moment of the dancers with the serpents in their mouth, is a means of immunization and the pacification of this deadly threat, a defense shield and a loophole through which to escape and cross to another side. At the time that Varborg visited the Hopi, the tourists therefore were also messengers. All Hopi pueblos between 1890 and 1920 were in fundamental political conflict with a new state order that had incorporated them territorially and wanted to subject them to its laws. For the Hopi, a disruption of their ceremonial order and thus the destruction of their social structure was to be averted by all means, and that involved opposing the state's claim to legal, educational, and medical regulation, the prescribed creation of property through individual land allocations which contradicted all previous rights and obligations. And most importantly, in the course of the popularization of the snake ritual, the Hopi succeeded, unlike other Native American people, preventing a ban of their rituals on which the ceremonial order and their entire social structure rests. The Hopi split into two factions during their conflict with the US state. one adaptable and one unforgiving. But it was especially the faction of the unforgiving, the hostiles, who controlled the snake ritual and managed to recruit a large number of Indian activists to champion their cause. A large group of them was imprisoned by the US government on the Alcatraz prison island to break their resistance and had just returned shortly before the visit of Varborg. Their refusal to assimilate was part of widespread Indian resistance to US policies designed to erase each tribe's language and religion. The internal conflicts in Hopi society between those who rejected assimilation and those who favored it to some extent were resolved by segmentation without bloodshed. In 1906, the main settlement of Uraibi split up, shortly after the last snake dance tourists had left the place. New settlements were established, which still exist today. Afterwards, the Hopi limited tourism by banning photography of the snake ritual, which in principle is still in effect today. The Hopi's ban of photography was one of the first successful interventions in the area of indigenous cultural property rights. In 1913, Theodore Roosevelt came to observe the snake ritual, which marked a form of official recognition, however ambivalent, as an American patriotic ceremony. When Hopi relations to the United States were turning sour again, Hopi went on a trip to Washington and performed the snake dance in front of the White House in 1926 and lifted the photography and film ban for that occasion, once again making sure their ceremonies were not forbidden. The period between 1895 and 1923 also represents a decisive phase in Hopi's more recent history. The successful, but in part tragic, defense against an existential danger seen from within, a kind of world war. The last touristic photographs known from the snake ritual were made around 1923, the same year that Abbé Varborg held his lecture in Kreuzlingen. He was in search of an answer to the question, what elements are we entitled to call the essential characteristics of primitive paganism? There is Varborg taking a journey into what he perceives to be an ancestral past. He writes that he visits a dying out pagan culture, as if he too were convinced that a conquering European modernity has spelled a death sentence over non-modern paganism, as if following a natural law. It is curious, to say the least, that he is known as the art historian who has devoted his whole life to the resilience and revival of the heathen cosmos, to the resurgence of antique paganism in the Renaissance and beyond. His trip to the North American Southwest was a crossing of an imagined temporal barrier that classified the other as the past, as already dead or doomed to die. It was also a journey to the source and genesis of symbolic images, and that cannot be an issue of the past, insofar as images are being made and that genesis occurs again at every moment. This is therefore also a story of the inevitable chimeric nature of human memory and human imagination. Today the term primitive paganism sounds like an insult, or at least an embarrassment, a colonial knowledge formation designed to engineer a divide between the modern European and the colonized. And Varborg's text supports such readings, but it also provides much to support the opposite, to erase the colonial difference and to even go farther. Every time he pays heed to the kind of colonial discourse that wants to keep the primitive at safe distance, he undermines the argument and opens the perspective on a veritable decentering of Europe, on the possibility to write a cultural history not by European standards. That primitive paganism that Varborg speaks about, even though it is an impossible broad generalization, holds the key to a more universal genealogy, a set of cosmological practices that eclipse modernity from outside and from within. But that route has not been taken by the discipline of art history, just as Varborg himself did not develop it or drew all the consequences for his later work. Why does Varborg need the primitive? The primitive mind has been the arena for the relocation and projection of taboos and ontological riddles in colonial discourse. Christopher Bracken asks, what are savages for? The function of those terms is to create a mirror that reflects back something forbidden or foreclosed. Bracken says that the figure of the savage and the primitive embodies forbidden aspects of modern discourse. The taboo here seems to be the performative, the magic, the cosmogonic functions of symbolizations, of images and language. Savage philosophers are characterized as those who fail to discriminate clearly between words and things, and hence it is said that they still believe in magic. Such a letter and its projective mode of address can be wholly returned to the sender. Those making interferences about what primitive reasoning are usually guilty doing exactly what they say primitives do. And that is the case with Varborg's lecture too. But he used that mechanism of projection rather strategically for his own purposes. Varborg hoped to be able to provide evidence of mental recovery 4 years after his severe mental collapse. All in all, in delivering this lecture, the proof seems to have been successful, even though several setbacks delayed his release by more than a year. In 1922, Warburg's family asks Emil Kraepelin to come to see Varborg in the Kreuzlingen sanatorium where he was detained. Kraepelin advocated the theory of a smooth transition from pure sensory impressions to autochthonous hallucination. Kraepelin revised the diagnosis of Ludwig Binswanger, who had attested Varborg little hope for recovery. At the time, Kraepelin was the leading authority in the classification of mental disease. In the realm of mental disease, more than elsewhere, a diagnosis also contains a performative dimension, such that it may directly affect the condition of the patient. Emil Kraepelin attested Varborg prospects of healing and thus a possible return to his former life and pursuits. As a result of this diagnosis, this lecture was scheduled, aimed at a mixed bourgeois audience and oriented at a motif known to all the locals, the ceiling mural depicting the Brazen Serpent erected by Moses, which can be seen a few hundred meters from the sanatorium in the chapel of St. Ulrich as a prefigurative of the crucifixion. Varborg too undertakes the journey to gain a picture, and he builds it up again in the minds of his listeners. Varborg's psychic collapse and descent into what he once called the inferno of the mental asylum was directly connected with the First World War and its outcome. The catastrophe and violence that Europeans had brought into the colonial world had come home, and Varborg's descent into madness occurred where these two ends meet. He saw his high bourgeois society, and indeed the bourgeois cosmos, collapsing and broke down himself. His lecture on the snake ritual served as the pretense of a cure, as a vessel for the crossing from the underworld back into the world of the living. He is picturing forth. He charged the image with the powers of revival from sickness and the agonies of death, and takes the image of the Hopi Serpent people on a journey to Europe through a subterranean transfer, to graft onto it a whole series of European snake cults, from the Maenads of the Dionysian cults to the Homeric legend of the priest Laocoon to Asclepius, the god of healing, with the snake on his stick. But Varborg's Asclepius is not only the ancient god of healing, but also a first savior. His features are the traits that are found in the classical plastic art that bears the world savior. And this messianic Asclepius, the Hopi Asclepius, serves Varborg as a new travel guide through the religions of revelation back to Kreuzlingen, to the Ölberg Kapelle of the Church of Kreuzlingen, where Varborg finds the worship of this pagan idol again, above the crucifixion, in the form of a mural of Moses erecting the Brazen Serpent, with a pathos similar to that of the Laocoon group. And then Varborg finishes his lecture by describing how modern technologies, the leading technologies of the time of World War I, the telegraph and the telephone, are ruining the cosmos, the necessary mental distance that was created by the symbol and collapsed with the vanishing of physical distance. These are the technologies whose cosmic potentials for destruction he has witnessed himself. These are the ruins from which he now speaks. The mythical journey of the Snake Clan, their mythical parody and salvation historical repetition, and their own journey has merged in this way. In Kreuzlingen, they cross each other's path. It is only through this constellation that one encounters a whole series of parallels between Varborg's lecture situation and Hopi image politics in the time between Varborg's visit and his lecture. Varborg was the prisoner of a psychiatric institution. The Hopi were prisoners of a hopeless situation. the occupation of their territory by the US state. Neither could enforce their claims to freedom by force. The Hopi fought against the loss of their sovereignty and against the destruction of their ceremonial rites and their property system. Neither Varborg nor the Hopi could easily break out of their situation. In Kafka's words from the report for an academy, they found themselves in a situation in which freedom was no longer possible, only a way out. With the popularization of the snake ritual, the Hopi were able to mobilize more and more help from the outside world, and even had a US governor recalled who harassed the Hopi and wanted to ban the rituals, especially, what a surprise, the snake ritual and phototourism. They found a possible way out through skillful work on recategorization by the outside world. They found this way out through the loophole opened by the snake symbol, at the 0 point of symbolization that lies in a phobic blind spot where the ends of polarities meet, where polarities are undone and will be reborn again. The aim was to stage a projection surface, a chimera, and to pass through this chimera loophole, and in the process to take the entire world with you that might not even have noticed neither the passing nor the inversions paying for it. Only through this chimeric projection surface was it possible to shift the work of categorization by the outside world. The categories themselves have to be taken underground. Abi Warburg's lecture was an anti-psychiatric act, a ritual parody in which he staged himself both as object and subject of psychiatric and anthropological research. He assumed the role of the expert on logic and the magic of primitive man, which was how he titled the lecture. But the only primitive that had to be constantly brought to the fore in Warburg's text was the psychiatric patient himself, who, with the help of this lecture, worked on his diagnosis and its modification, but also presented his own imaging process and at the same time tested it experimentally. Warburg's template for the lecture on the Hopi snake ritual was not science, but a scientific mock-up or decoy. And not only a scientific mock-up, but also an iconographic mock-up, even a biographical mock-up, which is still effective today. If one reads through the records of the snake ritual, in which Fritz Sachsel assisted Warburg for 6 weeks, one realizes that all possible genres are sketched out, and that the biographical possibilities are tried out above all. It was about creating an image that could withstand projection by the outside world, and, above all, projection by the responsible psychiatric expert world. Because this equation of snakes with healing is, of course, also addressed to the psychiatrist who will eventually have the power to release him, and he takes up psychoanalysis on a grand scale, namely by trying to reconstruct or invent his own primal scene, a scene so terrible that it condenses the traumas of childhood. This is also about an escape into the outside world, and revolves around the Mater Incerta, the mother that has fallen terribly ill, and his escape from being forced by the family patriarch to recite Hebrew prayers by breaking taboos. One of them is reading German romanticizing tales of the Indian. This story is found in the preparatory notes. Too perfect to be true. It makes sense as a bedrock of the overall picture he's painting in his addressing of psychiatric authority. A prisoner escaped, and that was only possible by a trick. The tension rises when one fears whether this trick will work, and the artifice or the ruse must only succeed once, in this one moment, in 1923-24. The loophole he used for himself through the snake symbol was the exit route through which art history could have escaped from its modern prison, which has only ever expanded since. That prison has as many wings and yards as there are modern disciplines. But in our context, the disciplinary enclosure that matters bears a deceptively simple label. It is called art. Varborg's text is primitivist in method and identification. The Kreuzlingen lecture was a report for an academy in which subject and object of Varborg's depiction were identified with one another. It is the only known case in which it wasn't an artist who staged and felt himself to be mimetically predisposed primitive, but an art historian in order to reorder his biography, but also his handling of images from this identification. This uniqueness accounts for a striking feature and weakness of his text. From Edward Taylor to Lucien Levy-Bruhl, the ethnological search for primitive ways of thinking had proceeded in such a way that it formed a patchwork of very different ethnographic facts in order to illustrate a common principle with their help. This is what the corresponding literature had in common with the primitivism of the visual arts, as can be seen in the unending search for sources for Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avion. Of course, any art historian will discover a coherent iconography in that painting. For instance, Diana and her entourage discovering Actaeon and turning hunter into prey, and Demoiselles into predators. But then, art historians cannot resist the Rorschach test of an iconography in splinters and refractions, not in this primitivist meta-painting. Varborg presupposes this primitivism, but leads it into an inversion, without which Varborg's Mnemosyne is also unthinkable. Instead of referring a multitude of non-European models to a common theme from the history of primitive thought, Varborg takes the central pictorial act of the Hopi snake ritual, the most famous Kodak moment in the history of North American photography at the time, the shocking climax of snake taming, and uses it as a yardstick for an Occidental iconography. The lecture announces this inversion as follows. A look at similar phenomena in paganism in Europe should lead us to the question at the end. To what extent does this pagan worldview, as it exists among the Pueblo Indians, give us a yardstick for the developmental processes from primitive paganism to classical paganism and modernity? The answer of the Kreuzlingen lecture is, the snake is not sacrificed in this snake dance, but only transformed into an ambassador through consecration and mimesis and sent out to return to the souls of the deceased, in order to create the thunderstorm in the sky in the shape of lightning. In this way, Varborg found with the Hopi what Christianity and Judaism had attributed to themselves as human progress, the overcoming of the bloody sacrifice through symbolic acts of sacrifice and prayer. This revaluation had strange consequences for Warburg's scientific speciality, the afterlife of antiquity. In the service of the Hopi pathos formula of overcoming sacrifice, the Occidental history of image breaks down into a kaleidoscope, a kind of Rorschach test, whose image flight only comes to a halt again where it snaps with the Hopi scale in Kreuzlingen in the image of Moses' erection of the Brazen Serpent. In Arizona, as with Moses, the diegesis is not in Europe, but in a non-European desert before the law of salvation history, and refers to the non-European standard of a founding act that has founded Western history, but at the same time has already overcome it. Like Moses, Warburg establishes an image of serpent worship, which is to be understood as a type of human history. The redemption from the bloody sacrifice runs through the religious development history from the Orient to the Occident as the innermost ideal of purification. But this purification ideal is already realized in the snake dance of the Hopi and is not a privilege of the redemption religions. Thus, Warburg's pictorial act defies the linearity of a history of development. Nevertheless, Warburg's view of the snake ritual cannot simply be described as a successful or failed theory of negated sacrifice. It is precisely in this layer of the text that we are dealing with a classic variant of modern travel literature, namely a Persian letter to and from Europe, an underground journey back from the kiva of the Pueblos, via an imaginary cult of Asclepius of Kos, to the crypt of European history, at the center of which stood, for Warburg, the respective reinterpretation of the ritual order of the Eucharist, which in European history, since the introduction of the Corpus Christi, has had a decisive influence on the relationship between Christians and Jews. When Warburg writes in his Kreuzlingen notes, a fairy tale animal, apparently the most concrete product of the playful imagination, is in statu nascendi a laboriously conceived abstraction. It is a determination of circumference for phenomena which otherwise cannot be grasped in their passing incomprehensibility. Then this is a precise characterization of his own lecture in its passing incomprehensibility, its abstraction of primitive thinking, acting and feeling, understood in statu nascendi. In the words of Carlo Severi, a chimera, and the principle of the chimera. Warburg notes circle around this one fact. the phobic reflex of causation. Defense by linking the subject or object with beings of maximally increased comprehensible power is the basic act of the fairy tale-like thinking fighters for existence. Memory functions biomorphistically as a comparative substitute. This is to be understood as a defensive measure in the fight for existence against living enemies, which the phobically irritated memory tries to understand, on the one hand, in the clearest and most distinct extent, and on the other hand, in all its power, in order to be able to take the strongest defensive measures afterwards. These are tendencies below the threshold of consciousness. Through the substituting image, the impressive stimulus as objectified and created as an object of defense, these passages lose all their vagueness if one simply refers them to exactly what Varborg is doing and writing at the moment. The beings of maximally increased circumferential graspable power, these are the snakes from Oribe to Athens. The fight for existence against living enemies, that is the psychiatric confinement, the phobically irritated memory with the help of which the replacing image objectifies the impressive stimulus and transforms it as an object of defense and creates it anew. These are Warburg's autobiographical memories and gathered scientific records. The snakes, these are not just any symbols. They are the best illustration and guidance for the process of symbolization itself, also and especially for Warburg's own search for a new beginning. The text on the snake ritual represents iconology in its raw state, its eternal genesis in stato nascendi. This entails unrestrained free association, the art of over-interpretation and popular etymology, whose figures are as immortal as those of correct historical verifiability. Anyone who can handle snakes, thus, defies a really elementary phobia, a phobia that is supra-individual and anchored in the body. The snake is therefore, as far as phobia is concerned, not just any fairy tale animal. It is the animal par excellence. If one wanted to objectify the process of invocation and banishment of phobias in a symbol, one could probably not develop a better concept than Warburg's lecture, namely to focus on a snake ritual and to arrange all other facts according to this handling. A letter has been preserved from Warburg's 11-year-old niece, Gisela, in which she asked her uncle on October 30th, 1923, "My dear Uncle Abi, you are really right when you say that the whites are the savages. But if you say that the Indians are civilized, then I want to be a naturalist. Shall we go together?" The Hopi were not primitives, they were not savages, and they were not a prehistorical population. Their rituals were precisely tuned to the vegetation cycle, like a church year. According to recent research, the Hopi, like some other North and South American societies, are the descendants of populations that underwent the experiment of state building for a few hundred years, only to leave these states to ruin within a few years and establish democratic communities without centralized power. Today, as in Warburg's time, It is assumed that the Pueblo cultures are closely related to the Central American cultures, but in the course of such a rebellion or revolution, the bloody human sacrifice was replaced by bloodless ceremonies and a triumph of nonviolence. In this respect, Hopi research has taken a long voyage, only to return to the speculations of Varborg's turn of the century through a steadily deepening archaeological research, but this time on a quite different empirical basis. In this way, the political history of the New World also enters into a new theoretical discussion. The thesis of Pierre Clastre that many of the societies of North and South America are not pre-state societies but societies against the state seems to be confirmed in recent research in a striking way, also and especially for the Hopi, as the archaeologists Severin Fowles and Wesley Bernardini have pointed out. The Hopi's diplomatic success was made possible by their ability to think with their own image in the minds of the outside world, and this under conditions of social and cultural ordeal that might just as well have led to the ultimate destruction of the community. The ceremonial powers manifest themselves in the making of images. This form of organization can also be called image-based, in the sense that the responsibility for rituals, in the course of which altars and other cosmological image types were built and dismantled, conveys collective property rights and their reciprocal obligations as the vegetation cycle progresses. Shaping the images others have of you, the Hopi were prepared for this from time immemorial and had made use of it on previous historical occasions. In the defense against the Spanish occupation, in the integration of the Katsina religion, and in the invasion of the surrounding country and other nomadic immigrants. To think in terms of the responsibility for images and to grant or deny them to others as privileged was and remained the political basis of the Hopi societies. Severin Fowles suggests that ancestral Pueblo imagery is overwhelmingly about water and its movement. Pueblo imagery is to be understood through agricultural production, and this holds true to a considerable extent even today. And furthermore, it is not only about water, like an image of snake that depicts the snake but might at the same time symbolizes lightning or water lines. The suggestion is that an equation exists between water lines and images, that images are seen as an extension of water lines, as an infrastructural project, a form of irrigation extended through different media.